So in terms of introducing the speaker, I don't think I'll bother. Does anybody have any questions for me about me as the speaker? Alexis, good to see you, by the way. All right, well, then let's continue on with our program. Let's see here. So I have a story to tell you. I came out of the Navy. I was a naval aviator, a Navy guy for years. And my talk, why am I not clicking forward? Okay. So I started out in the meetup. I showed this picture, and I said, "What is this and where is it?" Pete already recognizes it. Does anybody else recognize it? I wouldn't expect you would necessarily, but does anybody have a guess of where it might be or what it might be? Well, it's a square in London, and it's pretty famous. Right, Trafalgar Square. And this is the statue on the top of Trafalgar Square. If you notice that, it's really sort of silly. There's the monument, and the statue's so small you really can't see it. But with a long-range lens or with a drone.
Well, they cleaned up all the pigeon poop.
Right, they clean it up every once in a while. So who is this? Does anybody know who this might be? Trafalgar? Well, this is my story today. Oh, so what happened here? Here's the coast of Spain, and that Andalusia is not separate from Spain. It's a province of Spain, and the Cape Gibraltar is right about here, and the Cape of Trafalgar is right off the East Atlantic coast of Spain. And do you all know what happened there? Because that's our story today. It's the Battle of Trafalgar that was such a great success that the British put up a park and have recognized our hero of our story. So I'm calling this Lord Nelson, the hero and savior of his nation. So let's see here. So what happened at Trafalgar? Off Cape Trafalgar was the site of a historic naval battle of Trafalgar in October 21st of 1805. Now, one thing about it I think is interesting. Trafalgar is not really an English word. It's not a Spanish word. I think it's an Arabic word, to tell you the truth, as the Muslims, Islam ran southern Spain for many centuries. So let's see. The Battle of Trafalgar was a decisive naval victory for England. It was led by Vice Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, and it thwarted Napoleon's invasion of England and secured English naval supremacy for over a century. And even into World War II, the British naval supremacy came out of the fact that the British beat everybody at Trafalgar. Nelson's innovative tactics involved splitting his fleet to attack the French and Spanish lines from 2 points. So this is a ship, sailing ships. And what they would do is they'd line up enemies across from enemies, and they would fire at each other until one of the ships was succumbed, and then they'd sail over and board them and try and capture the ship or whatever. And you'll see here in a minute that Lord Nelson had a problem. He was outgunned. He had a smaller fleet, and there was some risk in this. If you have an equal number of ships in the fleet, they fight one-on-one. But if you have a large number of additional ships on the other side, 2 ships gang up on one or 3 ships gang up on one, and that's really hard for the ships to deal with. They call it doubling and tripling. So his idea was to avoid that. He needed to come up with a better tactics. So let's talk about what actually, so here are the players. On the left these are all paintings, of course. We don't have newsreels from 1805. But on the left is a painting of Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson. And on the right, there was another admiral involved with the British also, and that was Cuthbert Collingwood. Each were vice admirals, though Lord Nelson ran the battle. On the enemy side, the French and Spanish fleet had merged. And the French admiral was Pierre Charles Villeneuve, and the Spanish admiral was Federico Gravina. What was happening in Europe at this time is that Napoleon was overrunning Europe. His land armies were just beating everybody. And the forces of the city of Naples, Austria, 4 or 5 countries, and the English got together saying that one thing we need to do is to stop the British, the Napoleon from invading England, because England had blockaded all of the French ports. And they were not successful in their collaboration, but Lord Nelson solved that problem at Trafalgar. So let's talk about, I think the next slide is the battle overall. So the left-hand column is the size of the English fleet. And by the way, this is the old term English. This is English used in 1805. This includes the Irish, the Scotch, the Welsh, and the various parts of England, but they called it England in those days. And again, the commanders and leaders on the left side was Horatio Nelson. He died of wounds in the battle. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And the other one I talked about was Cuthbert Collingwood. They had, on the British side, had 27 ships of the line, 4 frigates and a couple other small ships. They had 458 killed in the battle, and they had 1,200 wounded. The Spaniards and the French had merged together. The French were not a big sailing power, even though they've got a lot of coastline. And Napoleon's strength was in the army, and he really wanted to invade England. That's what he wanted to do. But he couldn't put barges of 20,000, 30,000 troops on the English Channel while the British had control of the channel. They'd have sunk the barges, and he was stymied from that. And of course, he never did invade England. But the French and the Spanish together had 33 ships, 5 frigates and 2 brigs, and they lost 4,300 killed in this battle, and they had 2,500 wounded. They had around 7,000 to 8,000 captured by the English, and they lost 17 ships captured. 1 ship was destroyed. So it was a tremendous one-sided battle, and it's not unexpected that this would happen. The French didn't have money to train. They didn't have money to outfit their ships very well. So they had a lot of ships. And they had 1 ship, I'll tell you in about a minute, was gigantic, the biggest ship in the battle. But the British were disciplined and had a lot of experienced sailors. And they were firing at maybe twice the rate of any of the Spanish ships. So when they engaged, the French and the Spaniards were outnumbered in terms of number of shells fired. Again, Napoleon was the dominant land power in the European continent, and he did want to invade England. I already mentioned the Royal Navy controlled the seas and had blockaded France, which kept the French from trading and from using their naval resources. And the third coalition was this group of countries that put together an effort to try and stop Napoleon, and it didn't really work. He still kept overrunning the land, but Lord Nelson fixed him on the sea. What actually happened was the British went sailing from England down into the down towards Spain, looking for the French fleet and the Spanish fleet, and they thought that the French and Spanish fleet had traveled to Egypt. And so they sailed all their fleets into Egypt. It turned out they missed them, and the Spanish and French sailed all the way to the Caribbean to pull the English away. And so Lord Nelson and Cuthbert and their fleet sailed over the Caribbean, and then eventually they came back. The French and Spanish went up into the English Channel and had 2 ships sunk in an initial battle, and the French admiral said, "I've had enough of this," and he went back to Trafalgar, and that's how they ended up meeting at the Trafalgar battle site. One of the ships I think is interesting, that was the largest warship in the battle, and it was a Spanish ship called the Nuestra Señora de la Santísima Trinidad. This is our Lady of the Sanctified Trinity, or the Holy Trinity, would probably be a name for it. It was a ship with 1,050 crewmen and 116 guns, so it was a very large ship. And it was built in Havana, of all things, back in 1769. I didn't know they were building big ships like that in the U.S. at that point, but they were at this point. So Admiral Nelson's strategy in Trafalgar, he was outnumbered with 27 to 33 ships of the line, including the Santísima Trinidad. But the French crews were inexperienced, poorly trained, and poorly supplied, and the English crews were well trained and seasoned. What Nelson did, instead of lining up the English versus the French-Spanish, he ended up cutting into the line. I have my next slide, I think, will tell you about that. But he took a very unusual strategy of breaking up the French and Spanish line. Before that, I have to tell you one other thing. He knew that his gunners were better than the Spanish gunners, so he painted all his ships gold and black. So all the gunners could say, don't shoot at gold and black ships. And this became called the Nelson Checker. And maybe even it was used for decades later to make sure that British ships weren't firing on their own friendly ships in the battle. So, I've already told you about how they lined up horizontally. One of the reasons they lined up horizontally is the flagships could put up flags giving instructions to all the ships in their line, and this is how the admiral could actually change the strategy while they were traveling. They didn't have they didn't have communications or blinking lights or electronic equipment. But if they were in a line, the admiral's ship could put up flags that tell the rest of the ship what the rest of the fleet what to do. But again, Nelson wanted to break into a chaotic melee to make this happen. What he did outside of Cadiz, he kept his fleet 50 miles to sea so that the French wouldn't know for sure that they're out there. But the admiral, this Villeneuve, the French admiral, was scared to death of the English, and he was very reluctant to come out. He did finally come out, and the wind calmed, and the battle was done in slow motion, very, very slow motion. This is a drawing. I know you can't see the details here, but the right arc of blue ships and black ships is the French and Spanish fleet, and the arrows are the English fleet. And the flagship, the Royal Sovereign, had Admiral Cuthbert in it, and the Victory had Admiral Nelson in it. And instead of lining up, they went through and turned around and started engaging in a melee rather than this battle. One of the issues with a battle when you're lined up is that if you're losing, you can pull away and save your fleet. Whereas, in other words, it's a strategy to prevent losing. That lineup is designed to prevent you from losing the battle, because you can always pull away from the enemy and keep your fleet together. Lord Nelson said, I need to do something creative here. I'm outnumbered a little bit. I'm better trained, but I'm going to break this into a mess where everybody's fighting everybody, and my gunners will outperform the French and the Spanish. He kept out of sight. The French were short on supplies, too. They were cash short. And I already mentioned the weather got calm. Okay, we talked about this. I guess I got out of order here a little bit. Yeah, so the line also allowed either side to disengage by breaking away in formation, which allowed the losing side to minimize its losses. But Nelson wanted to be creative and stop that from happening. Whoops. I'm sorry. What am I doing? I'm going the wrong direction, I guess, in this thing. My clicker isn't working for some reason here, but okay, we talked about that. So during the preparation for this engagement, it was pretty apparent this was going to be the major engagement between Napoleon's forces and the British forces. And the fate of England rested in this battle. If the French and Spanish beat the English here, they were going to sail into the English Channel and launch barges of troops across the English Channel to invade England. And Nelson put out the signal to his fleet by flags, England expects that every man will do his duty. And I think it might be the U.S. Victory, it might be a replica that exists, and this is the flags that he flew. And I thought it might be interesting to look at wait. So this is the flags he flew. The first flag is, three flags is England. The next one is expects that every man will do his. And duty was not a flag. You had to spell the words. So there's a D, a U, a T, Y. And each ship could then read that and know what the admiral was saying. I think it's sort of an interesting thing here. What are we doing here? I'm sorry, I'm going back. So the offensive exposed the leading English ships to intense crossfire as they approached into the French arc. The French could fire at the English, and the English couldn't fire at the French because the guns go out to the side. So as the English ships are going into the French formation, they couldn't shoot. There were no guns in the front of the ship, but the Spaniards could shoot at them. And again, the seas were calm, and that was a risk to his strategy. And as they engaged in the battle, a French musketeer shot Lord Nelson on the deck of his ship. I'll show you a painting of that in a minute. And he died before the battle was over, but he knew they had won. He was 47 years old when he died. I'm going the wrong way all the time here. I know this is a mess of a picture, but I think we have Lord Nelson right here laying, and you can see this is the English ship, but there's French or Spanish ships on both sides firing back and forth. In the battle, the French admiral was captured, Villeneuve was captured, along with his flagship, the Beau Centaur, and the most senior Spanish commander, Federico Gravina, escaped. However, he died of the injuries from that battle. He survived for 6 months, but he actually did die from wounds from the Battle of Trafalgar. Okay, what am I doing here? The right direction. So I have a couple of paintings to help you think about what this might be like. It's a real melee. You're looking who's near you to shoot at. If it's an enemy, you go after him. If it's not, you go trying to go some other direction. It's all done in slow motion. But this painting, and you notice there's some people that have already abandoned their ship in boats, waiting for the battle to resolve before they can get rescued. And this is another painting of it, not a very good painting, but it was a mess. It was just a big mess. And the results, the victory confirmed English naval supremacy and was achieved in part through Nelson's departure from prevailing naval tactical orthodoxy. And there was a gale, the British captured 17 ships, but there was a gale right after that, and most of those ships sank and were lost. The British didn't really recover any ships after the gale that damaged and captured the ships. And following that battle, the Royal Navy was never again seriously challenged by the French fleet in large-scale engagements. Napoleon had abandoned his plans to invade England because he just wasn't going to be a possibility. And I say the Royal Navy proceeded to dominate the seas from 1805 till the Second World War to a great extent, at least in the European theater. Nelson became and remains the greatest naval hero, an inspiration to the Royal Navy. And the authors I read said that the unorthodox tactics he used were seldom emulated by subsequent admirals. In other words, he was a creative guy, but the institution of the Royal Navy wasn't that creative overall. Trafalgar Square was finished in 1843, and so that's a quick look at Trafalgar. I thought I'd show you the ship that I was on, for what it's worth. A little different than a sailing vessel. It's a John F. Kennedy, 5,000 sailors, about 75 aircraft. Did you enjoy that, or was that, okay, it's a little tangential to humanism or the things that go on today, but I think it's worth talking about. Is there any questions or comments about that? Yeah, go ahead.
If Nelson was coming directly at them,
I guess I'll...
but his guns were...
Yeah.
If Nelson was coming...
Yeah, turn it on.
Oh.
I can hear. I'm all the way over here.
But we want to get it recorded, so we're trying to do...
Does that work? Oh, sure. Okay. So Nelson and his line, his ships are all coming directly at a 90-degree angle.
Yeah.
But their guns are being pointed on the side. So how did they manage to actually get to the point of melee without just being picked off?
Yeah. Well, what happened was they went around and curled both directions and engaged the enemy. Now the French no longer could maintain a line. They were engaging the attacking English forces, and it became a mix, just a melee of everybody's targeting.
So
this
they
is
just kind of spun around.
They spun around and got them all into a loop, and now everybody's fighting individually. And the British gunners outgunned the Spaniards and the French significantly, and that's how the battle was so unevenly sided. Lord Nelson, anyway. Okay, any other questions or comments?
So why is Lord Nelson credited and not the other guy, or not with
He was
the
the senior admiral, and he's the guy that cast the plan. They'd worked on this plan for quite a while. Mm-hmm. Even Villeneuve, the French admiral, knew that Nelson was not going to line up. He said he knows how Nelson was really aggressive and strategic. But he didn't know what to do. He just went with his standard defense, and Nelson took advantage of it. It could be that Nelson would have won even in a parallel because they outgunned the Spaniards and French, better trained, better disciplined. Yeah.
How prevalent was the use of snipers on ships like this, and would their primary duty be to get like the leading officer?
I don't know too much about it, but they use snipers. They're in close combat. The cannoners are firing cannons, and the snipers are up in the sails of the other ship, firing down to shoot at the gunners on the enemy ship. It was
Just about any way they could.
Yeah, and they had Marines. I mean, the Santissima Trinidad had 1,100 troops on it. I mean, 1,100 sailors. They had hundreds of Marines with guns and bayonets that were going to board a ship if they thought they could capture it.
When these ships are in battle, how far apart are they? What is this?
Boy, I don't know the answer to that. The gun ranges aren't that long, so they're not like today where you're firing over the horizon. 100 feet, 200 feet or something, I imagine, 300 feet maybe. Pretty brutal. I mean, firing cannonballs at each other, and, it's a rough thing. I thought one interesting thing I'd point out that my only resource was Wikipedia for this. So I skimmed it a little bit out of it, but it was a good enough story, I think. Okay, anyway. So,